right, so good evening, everybody. My name is Milton Georges. I'm a technical solutions consultant here at AppNexus. Basically, I help clients integrate on top of our platform using our APIs. And tonight, I'm going to be talking about the collaboration between TurboVote and AppNexus on behalf of AppNexus's Tech for Good program. I'm going to dive into the implementation we've done with them. So again, short introduction about AppNexus, because Fatima just gave you one, but we're basically a technology platform that powers one of the world's largest programmatic media exchanges. Our mission is to make the internet a better place. We basically building the best tools for content creators to get paid for their efforts and for advertisers to reach the most relevant audiences, and ensuring the internet remains free and open. And we basically offer advanced programmatic buyers and sellers tools to do that through the APIs. We offer a simplified platform for traders through the UI. And we also we do this all through leveraging the sophisticated machine learning and data science at scale. At scale meaning 5 to 6 million impressions at peak, as Fatima also noted. So TurboVote integration, it basically leverages AppNexus' scale to deliver upcoming election information using tools that integrate in our PSA rotation. I will explain what a PSA means in the following slides. But for now, just know that we can deliver geo-targeted impressions for upcoming elections in specific areas, and we can also dynamically generate creatives to help deliver all of these election information. So how do we do this? First, a little background on Tech for Good. Tech for Good, or as we lovingly refer to it as TFG here at AppNexus, our mandate is to pursue positive social impact in the world through building scalable technology and partnership in the nonprofit sector, leveraging our AppNexus engineering and tech operation resources to build tech for good. So there's a lot of really cool people that we partnered with and organizations that we partnered with, one of them being TurboVote, to help deliver their messaging on the internet. So some of the TFG highlights are that we're basically all volunteers at AppNexus across all departments. That includes services, the department I'm in. It includes engineering, marketing, whatever it may be. And we have partnerships, again, in the nonprofit sector. And we leverage AppNexus scale and engineering. So for those of you internally here, we have a Slack channel, Tech for Good at AppNexus, if you want to join that. And also we have a techforgood@appnexus.com alias. If you have any worthwhile projects for a noble cause we could offer some technical help for. Such a short plug for Tech for Good. And we're going to dive into the PSA program. Again, leveraging AppNexus' scale to promote causes to help bring a positive change in the world. So a PSA, as you may know, is a public service announcement. They're basically messages in the public interest delivered at no charge. AppNexus partners with many cool organizations. You see here, again, these are some older creatives that were easy to pull from the wiki space for me, but we have Smokey the Bear here, we have Ad Council, Alzheimer's. There's a lot of cool creatives or advertisements that will run in the internet. And we'll do that in place of an actual advertisement. And I'll explain how that actually works. We will deliver one of these creatives anytime an impression blanks. What does that mean? So basically, we serve on impression errors. A blank is when some type of error occurs during the auction process. So we have a placement on page, which is the opportunity to serve a creative or an impression. We have about 100 milliseconds to complete that process, which is, as you imagine, very fast. It's usually much faster before the web page actually loads. So if any error occurs in that process, what we first do is we check to see if the publisher has some type of messaging they want to deliver in place of that auction. So say if they're not going to get actually paid for that impression, we'll see if they have something they want to deliver in place of that blank. And if not, some publishers opt to participate in our PSA program, which is basically we'll rotate in a public service announcement anytime an error like this happens. So as you can imagine, we recently pulled the number, so it's more than 5 million impressions per peak. I think most recently we had 6 million platform impressions a peak per second. So you can million with like 6 million, 6 million, 6 million. There's lots of opportunities for things to mess up, and lots of opportunities to serve a PSA. And we'll get into some reporting numbers here. So slightly technical chart here. This is a flow chart, what happens. We go to deliver a creative or an opportunity for an impression to be delivered. If this is not the UI, or we're not just showing a preview of that creative to someone who's uploaded it, then we're actually in an auction. We have some auction logic that takes place, and if something is won, it goes off into the little cloud internet thing here. which is a whole entire other system we're not going to dive into. But if there's an error that occurs during this whole process, again, we'll see if the publisher has a default creative they want to serve. If not, we're going to do a PSA. And if we don't actually have a match for a PSA, which is kind of based on the targeting parameters that are set, then we really will blank, which is like nothing is shown and nothing appears in that advertisement space. So some PSA partners that we have, some pretty great organizations. We have the Red Cross, Ad Council, Alzheimer's, the World Wrestling Federation. I'm just kidding, it's my favorite joke. And there's also Charity Water, etc. So some pretty cool organizations here. And again, we partner with the Federation of Internet Alerts to do some of these things. This is relevant for a number of reasons. I'll show you what's happening here. The Federation of Internet Alerts uses internet advertising partners to display official child abduction, aka Amber Alerts, and extreme weather alerts across the internet. And they do this by partnering with a number of ad tech companies, Amazon Cloud being one of them, Conversant being another, AppNexus being another. They basically take this free public service is always on, taking in and distributing common alerting protocol alerts, CAP alerts. CAP alerts are formatted as XML, and there's a standard for a CAP alert that's basically sent around the internet. And the FIA Hub we call it the FIA Hub, Federation of Internet Alerts Hub. It can listen for these alerts and then pass them on to AppNexus. And the AppNexus will translate that XML text into a live ad campaign, including a dynamic creative. As you can imagine, like we can't ingest like thousands of alerts every day and make a graphic for it every time. So we have some technology on the back end that automatically or dynamically creates an advertisement asset, or a creative as we call it. So for example, these are also geo-targeted, and if you're in New York, you're not going to receive a notification for an impending ballistic missile strike. That's not a drill. You may actually get an Amber Alert, or you may get a ballistic missile strike. That's not a drill. So here's a general overview of how this all works. This is a very high-level diagram, but basically here's the FIA Hub, here's Conversant. They push XML messaging to AppNexus, our FIA Hub. We write that out to information about the database to track for reporting purposes to see what's actually running. And then we communicate through AppNexus console, which is basically our buying platform, through the API to run live campaigns on our platform. Again, we analyze whether there's a CAP or Amber Alert and take proper action to do what we need to do. And we update our databases and send out reporting. So here's an example of what Amber Alerts look like. Here's Amber Alert, here's a weather alert. And we're also going to be rolling out implementation soon that integrates with New York Transit displays, such as like the MTA displays you see in the subways. So a lot of opportunities for eyes to get on these Amber Alerts and for these extreme weather notifications. Hopefully not an extreme weather notification in New York. That'd be very scary. But as you can imagine, here's where the TurboVote implementation comes into play. This also integrates with this FIA Hub. And here's a tech overview of how that looks like. So again, we have this chart where Federation of Internet Alerts and Conversant are pushing us XML messages that we are then writing out to a FIA Hub database for tracking. And here's where the TurboVote implementation comes into play. We have another process that pulls from the Democracy Works API. Mike Ward's going to be coming up next to talk about the Democracy Works API. And again, we track which elections, we pull upcoming election information from TurboVote, and we track what's already being run on the platform. And then we push an XML message to the FIA Hub, which runs it just like another alert. And again, this integrates with AppNexus console and pushes a PSA campaign. And then we also have a reporting process that we send out to the TurboVote constituents every week. Now I'm going to get kind of nerdy, so I'm going to go through these next slides pretty fast, but this is a tech talk. Again, so here's what the Democracy Works API information looks like. It's a JSON formatted message, rather. It gives you a date, gives you an ID that we use to track. A bunch of other information. Here's a pretty important one, the OCD ID. Oops, I should do it on this one. Here's the OCD ID. And you can see here's basically like something that shows the location that the selection's happening. So country, US, state, Oklahoma, place, billings. And we use that to actually do some of the geo-targeting, as well as we have date time to actually run these elections on. So from a tech perspective, if you noticed that TurboVote box right there, that's what this thing is doing. It has a table to track all the elections we've ingested so that when we pull information every day, we know what to send to the FIA Hub. We basically have election ID, which is TurboVote's external ID, the date created, the date if it uploaded successfully, if we have to retry it or not, or if we've deleted it. This is just a very simple SQLite database, which is not super productive. Like it's not like nothing more that we need to run than this. And all the information is actually stored in the FIA Hub in a proper MySQL database after that. And we also have integration with the AppNexus API, where we cache all of the geolocation so that we're not hitting the API every time we need to get information about like what DMA does Joyce, Louisiana map to, like this ID 628. Because there is like rate limits on our API, and this has to be done very fast as we get these messages. So we basically store a local cache of that. So it looks like this. We push it through this XML builder. It's sent by TurboVote. Here's the namespace. Here's the location we want to run it, and it generates an XML message. And if we prettify that XML message, it looks like this. You can see here's the identifier for the election. It's sent by TurboVote at appnexus.com. It's an alert. Scope is public. Run it during these dates. It expires on this date. So this gives the information. This gives the system all the information it needs to know as to where it should run this and how long it should run it for. And then part of the dynamic HTML5 creative part of it is that we get a template like this from TurboVote, and then we dynamically fill the information in, basically passed in with macros at the time of delivery. So again, here's just some JavaScript that's delivered along with the creative that has a bunch of macros. Again, we're not going to understand this code right here really quickly, but like we populate all the information that needs to be written to this creative, and we do it with canvas tag. So we only have about 5 creatives that we run on this platform, but that translates to thousands of elections potentially on the front end. And again, why are we doing this? Here's some results. Literally, this is just this past week. There's not too many elections running right now, but we have one from Oklahoma City, and 1 week it had over 220,000 impressions delivered for free, and then that's not counting different sizes. So here it is again, running with 46,000. So that's a 300 by 250. This is 728 by 90. We have clicks, we got conversions. So in like 1 week, we have like millions of impressions delivered. If we run in a bigger space, like say an actually statewide election, you'll see millions of impressions delivered in a day. So that's some good free advertising for TurboVote. It's good to get that message out there. And when we're fully integrated and we're able to run like more locations based on the OCD ID, you'll see these numbers jump significantly higher. And that's basically my portion. I'm going to bring up Mike Ward from TurboVote to talk about the Democracy Works API and how we integrate with them.
So while this is connecting, I'll give you guys a brief overview of what this is going to look like. I'm going to introduce Democracy Works. I'm the TurboVote program director. TurboVote is one of our 3 program areas. And then I'll call up Ben and Chris, who are developers who build the thing that does all the best stuff. I'm obviously technical. And then Ben and Chris are going to ask Monica to come up. Monica is our government program director, and she also product manages there. So she'll talk about what it looks like to product manage for government technology, or technology that's meant to help government officials serve elections rather than TurboVote, which is more public-facing. So before we actually start this thing, I love this little snippet about democracy history. George Washington lost his first election in the United States. Well, before it was the United States, before we had states at all. And in Virginia, he was running for a local office. And he learned from that first election to his second election a thing that he could do differently in order to win. His competitor did this thing in the first election and beat George Washington by about 40 votes. If you could just take a second and think about something, it's not something that politicians are allowed to do anymore, but something that you think George Washington might have done to influence voters the second time he ran so that he successfully won the election. And while you're doing that, I'm going to pull up some stats about it. All right, whatever your idea is, if you thought that George Washington bought everybody an obnoxious amount of alcohol, you are right. He bought 28 gallons of rum, 50 gallons of rum punch, 34 gallons of wine, 46 gallons of beer, and 2 gallons of cider royale. It was a total of over 160 gallons of alcohol. I don't remember, it's not on this page, I don't remember exactly how many votes he got, but in any case, I'd say that that was an effort that I think he won in a landslide and was probably the right way to go about winning an election. It's illegal now, but just to give you a sense of how our democracy used to work. So since we're in New York City, I'm going to have you guys do another thought exercise. We had a mayoral election last fall. There are about 8.5 million residents of New York City. Approximately 5 million of them are eligible to vote, meaning that the remainder are ineligible because of age, citizen status, or another obstacle that makes them ineligible. Of the 5 million people who are eligible to vote, I'd like you to just kind of think about how many people you think voted for Bill de Blasio in fall of last year. He won the vote, he won 66% of the vote, which is a landslide. How many of the 5 million people that are eligible, not actually voted, how many people that were eligible to vote voted for Bill de Blasio last year? And I will address that answer momentarily. So let's jump into this. I believe whatever the issue is that you care about, that you should be invested in the health of our democracy, because without it, your issue, whether it's healthcare, education, or anything else, will not move in the direction you want it to move. In the last midterm, we had historically low, since World War II anyway, and in World War II they had a pretty good excuse for not voting in a midterm. We had historically low voter turnout. Our democracy is unhealthy. Now, briefly to go back to whatever you were thinking about how many votes Bill de Blasio got in the last election, 8.5 million people live in this city. He won with 66% of the vote in the fall. 66% was approximately 750,000 people. Less than 10% of this city voted for him, and he won in a landslide. And that is not a New York City problem. New York City is one of dozens, hundreds, thousands of municipalities around the country who have low voter turnout. And local elections are more important than federal in so many ways. So why don't people vote? Because of process barriers, much of the time. Sometimes it's apathy. They don't like the candidates, they don't like the issues, but so much of it is process, and we exist to help resolve these process barriers. Here are some of the things that voters will face in the process of figuring out how to cast their ballot. Learning about, just knowing that an election is happening. The fact that Milton showed you guys how many elections happened this past week, I guarantee you that most of the people in those places did not know that those elections were happening. And you can see here all the other things that a voter might face that keeps them from voting. So we exist to build technology and data sets to make voting fit the way we live today. From an entirely nonpartisan perspective, we don't do any advocacy, we're not trying to change laws, we're trying to work within the context of what is available to us as a country to bring technology to democracy. I'm the TurboVote program director. TurboVote is a platform that helps people register to vote and helps them turn out to the polls by sending them text and email reminders. If you are unsure whether you voted in every election you were eligible for in the past year, go to turbovote.org, sign up. We will help you register to vote if you're not registered at your current address. And if you are, you can say, I'm registered, and we will send you election notifications so that you never miss an election again. The Voting Information Project is a collaboration with Pew and Google where we research, QA, and provide to the Google Civic API a data set of polling place locations. And then our Gov department, which Monica will be talking about, includes the Election Tech Cooperative, where we're building open source technology and coordinating the election tech space so that we have better tech for our election officials. And before I hand it off to Chris and Ben, the last thing I'll mention is that in addition to the PSA program that we're currently running with AppNexus, in the fall, we did an experiment with AppNexus and a couple of other partners. Because AppNexus allows us to take a voter file of registered voters, by the way, when you register to vote, most of the information that you register with becomes public record. We can take a public voter file, figure out who we can reach via the AppNexus platform, and then after the election, we can match back to the voter file to see how many people successfully registered to vote, or successfully voted. We could also do it with voter registration, but we did it with getting out to the polls this past year. So we delivered ads to over 700,000 people in New Jersey and Virginia. We had a control group. And once that voter file data, which takes like 8 months to get back after an election because government is slow, Despite the fact that the government is us, it is you and I, it is also exceedingly slow. And so we will match back to the voter file to see whether our control group voted at a lower rate than the people who were served these different sorts of ads, so we can understand whether different ads work better at turning people out to the polls. And this is unique because it is so challenging to find another way to serve ads to voters and then be able to match them back to the voter file later. So that's why AppNexus is such an important partner in that. So I will invite Ben and Chris up next to go through a little demo with you guys.
Hi, I'm Ben.
You ready? Did you say something? Not paying attention.
I said I was Ben, but we can.
Oh yeah, I'm Chris.
We're both developers on the TurboVote platform, and we're going to tell you about how we designed it and how we built it and how it works. So more specifically, we're going to focus on TurboVote sign-up notifications. And so when a user wants to sign up for TurboVote, they go to turbovote.org or one of our partner branded sites. They give us their name and their address and preferences for whether or not they prefer to vote by mail or vote in person, whether or not they prefer to register online or register by mail or in person and things like that. We match their users by their address. We match their users to their election jurisdictions through these things called district divisions, which I'll go into later. District divisions also have associated election authorities that set those types of regulations, like whether or not they allow online voter registration or whether or not they require a voter ID to register.
Right, and also deadlines for registering to vote or deadlines to ask for absentee ballots. That's up to those election authorities.
And so actually I'm now going to go into a test sign up. This is a local TurboVote instance running on my machine in that terminal down there. So if it doesn't work, that's why it doesn't work. First, we get to the Get Started screen, and then you enter your information. And then after that, you tell it how you want it to notify you. We're going to do both here. And one of the things we do in this application is each screen that you go through, we try to keep track of the information that you give us and send it back to the server as much as we possibly can. And so now when I continue, there's going to be a new user that's created. And then when I get a new user, we immediately get notifications. Like I just got one on my phone with a text saying, "Welcome to TurboVote." And then I'm already registered, so I'll say, yes, I'm registered, and then I'll give them my address. And then it asks me if I've moved, and I haven't. I do not have a registration party. And and so yeah, my next election is tomorrow, and so it's lucky that I signed up for TurboVote because I would have never known about that. And I prefer
I forgot that I added that.
And so then I prefer to go at the polls. And so right now, TurboVote is, the TurboVote services are communicating with each other, building the notifications that I'm gonna need about what I need to vote, what time the polls open, and things like that.
I want to mention that if he had chosen that he wasn't registered to vote or that he had moved, he would have been walked through either going to the New York State website to register, or if he didn't want to do that, wanted to print out a form to mail in, we would ask enough information to be able to fill out as much of that as we can, and then generate a PDF for him to print out himself and just sign and mail in. But this was like the very easy path.
Yep. There's a lot of different ways that you can wind through the app. And so now let's go back into district divisions. So first, they're a hierarchical representation of political jurisdictions. So you can imagine you've got a state, and then you've got a county, and then in the county, there's a city. They take the structure from the second bullet, where it starts with OCD division. Then you've got the country and the country code, and then you have a repeating pattern of a type and the type ID. So possible types are state, city, or county, or place, and the type ID is just a unique identifier for that particular level. So in Colorado, you could have a city that as the type, and then the type ID would be Boulder or Denver. So for example, my Brooklyn OCD ID is OCD division, country US, OCD division, country US, state New York, and county is Kings, because Brooklyn is Kings County.
And there's also, for every address, there are a bunch of OCD IDs that will be associated. So this is the one for Kings County, but his address would also have ones for like the state Senate district, for like his congressional district, stuff like that. And the OCD in OCD ID is Open Civic Data, which is a group that's collaboratively building data schemas about like how you represent information about government in code, and it's used by a lot of people to make sharing this kind of information easier among organizations.
And so now let's go into the actual notification implementation. So first, they welcome the user to the platform when they first sign up, and every person who signs up gets the welcome notification. Then we look in to see when their next elections are, when their deadlines are, and based on what time those deadlines start, we start building notifications to send at the appropriate time. And users can decide if they want SMS or email, and we take those preferences and render the notifications that are appropriate to each user. And so to build all of this, we use services or microservices architecture. And there are a lot of things that went into the decision of that implementation. First, we wanted to make sure that we separated our application concerns among small, independent, and focused services. We wanted to make sure that we could be as flexible as possible about releasing external APIs for partnerships like the one we had with AppNexus, but we still want to protect the user data, the data that users have entrusted with us. And so services give us a clean way to divide the different kinds of APIs that we have. Also, we wanted to be able to scale our architecture as flexibly as we could, because some components really need a lot of resources, but other components, it would actually be a bad thing if we, if we scaled it too much. For example, we had a partner service to render some of our forms. We connected to them through FTP, and we were doing some scaling experiments, and we scaled all of our services to a number of different nodes for a partnership that we had with Facebook, and we knocked over our FTP partner because we had too many FTP connections. And so because we had the services architecture, we could scale that component down, but continue to scale all the other components that would be serving Facebook traffic. And so to communicate between the services, we use RabbitMQ queues and event exchanges. We pass messages through the queue that have the relevant information. And each service has a handler function that's listening to whatever queue that they're concerned with. And we use Clojure for all of our software, and a library that we use for back pressure and to communicate with RabbitMQ. We use Clojure Core async channels, and we also released an open source library to help helps services communicate with RabbitMQ through Clojure called Keyhar, which was written by Chris.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so now we could talk about the individual services that come together to do everything we need. So when the user first signs up, when they enter their address, we geocode that address with AddressWorks, with our AddressWorks service. That calls a Smarty Streets API to verify and validate the address that they've entered. Then we use a Google Civic Info API to associate that address with the district division or the OCD IDs. And then after we geocode the address, we store all of the user's information in UserWorks. So that's the name, email address, phone number, geocode, registration address, and some other metadata about the user. And each time we create a user, we emit a user create event that other services are listening to that wake up whenever a new user is created. And I'll get into that a bit. So we also have, on the other side, Election Works. So we have Democracy Works staff who go around looking at the publicly available information about when the next election is going to happen, what the dates are, when the deadlines are, and they load that up into our Election Works database. And then that's behind the Election Works service, which serves API and information about all the elections that are going to take place across the country, from a presidential election to a school board meeting. They're all in there.
And that's a big lift.
It's a huge lift
for people to do, because it's everything from, there are some places that provide that information really easily. Sometimes it's, like there's a bunch of Google alerts for searches, and then sometimes it's just like calling county clerks on a regular basis to be like, hey, when's the next election here? So yeah, it's the reason why there isn't election information available for everywhere is because no one but us is trying to collect that data.
And just like UserWorks, with each new election that gets created, we emit another election create event, and other services are listening for those events, and then they'll snap into action when they need to. And so now we have Electorate Works, which serves as a join service between UserWorks and Election Works. And this is, so whenever a user signs up and there's already an election that's relevant to them in the system, Electorate Works associates a user with that election. Later on, we use those associations to figure out when to render the notifications for them, and when to send those notifications for those users as well. And yeah, this service listens to both the user create or the election create events to actually start building those electorates and then start rendering those notifications. And Notification Works this is where all of our templates are stored. So when you get an email, the email is going to say, hi, your name, and it's going to tell you about when the election is going to take place, and it pulls all that information from the user and from the election, renders it into a template based on SMS or email, whatever your preference is. But Notification Works gets called from the out, so it doesn't render the templates on its own. It's called from another service called Schedule Message Works. Calls another service that will be on the next slide, but Schedule Message Works stores messages that services can act on later. And these are not notifications in terms of what I get on my phone, like a text message. These are more messages that services use to communicate with each other. But sometimes you want to wait before you send a message. For example, when a user signs up, we don't immediately want to start sending them all of their notifications about when the elections that they have are relevant to them, because users can drop off at any time. They can just go to the first page and then just stop signing up from there, or they can go through the entire process. And it's hard for us to know exactly when they're going to drop off, and so we schedule a message for 10 minutes in the future. And then as they enter more and more information, we continuously reschedule that message, because we refine what we want to send them based on all of the information that they've given us. And so scheduled message works kind of wakes up and sees what work it has to do based on what time it is and what the messages that it has stored. And then it sends those messages out to the services for the services to act on them. And for the notification piece, election notification works really is the thing that ties everything together. So it responds to user sign-up message by scheduling notifications or user sign-up message that just have user ID, which is the auto-generated ID that we've created. It schedules and updates sign-up notifications with scheduled message works, so that when a new user gets created, it'll schedule it for 10 minutes in the future, and then it keeps rescheduling it as it gets more information. And then it renders the actual template from UserWorks or from Electorate Works and Notification Works. And then when those templates get rendered, they sit and wait until it's time for them to get sent out. And when they finally get sent out, it's something that, so one of the reasons that we render them so early, Chris, you can speak more to this.
So when a user is signing up and we know, for example, that there's an election coming up for them, but the deadline, it's just like, oh, there's an election in 4 weeks. We render the you vote tomorrow message that's going to go out to them right away. And it stays in scheduled message works until it's ready to go out. And one of the reasons why we do that is because, for example, on November 9th of this year, we're going to be sending out like a whole ton of Vote Tomorrow emails and SMSs. And we would like to be able to do that without needing to keep hitting services to look up usernames and election names and stuff. So we have them ready to go. But then also we have a way to query for those if we need to update them before they get sent out. So if somebody, for example, changes their name in our system, which is not something you can do at this time, but we would be able to, just re-render, have your new message re-rendered and rescheduled, when you do that, and not wait until the moment where we're trying to send 1 million messages out in a very short time.
And so that's the overview of the architecture.
Thank you. So I am indeed the Director of Government Services. I would love to know how many of you love to go and vote. How many of you is that your favorite thing ever? I see one hand in the back, but that's 1, 2, 3, 4. You work for us. You can't say that. 5, 6. Okay, there's 5 of you. There's a lot more people than that in this room. So that gives you sort of an idea. What I want to convey to you is that election administrators love the process of voting. They think everyone should vote. They want to make it as easy as possible for you. And if that doesn't sound like the voting experience that you are used to having when you go and vote, it's not because the election administrators don't want it. I always tell people I am the luckiest person in the world because I get to work with a group of people who are truly committed to making this work as best as possible that they can for you. Now, it doesn't always look that way for a number of reasons. Local governments, which is where elections are run, states run some things, the federal government runs almost nothing. It is run at the county level, or if you live in someplace silly like Massachusetts, it's run actually at the town level, which is even worse. But think about if every piece of technology you wanted to build had to go through a county budgeting process, and the thing you were competing against was potholes and sidewalks and lines on the streets. That's what election administrators face. So the voting process looks the way it does, not necessarily because they hate technology or because they don't want to make it awesome. They really do. But they're facing huge challenges in terms of resources, in terms of all the other things they have to do, and in terms of the fact that nobody really pays attention to elections until an election is already happening, and that's too late. So I will ask you this second question. How many of you have ever been a poll worker or an election judge in the states that you call it? Again, a couple of hands. If this is something you care about, if you really think that democracy is important, if you want to build civic technology, go be a poll worker. And I will tell you, it will blow your mind, because how you think we run elections is not at all how we run elections. And that's sort of my second point for you, is that part of what makes building technology for election officials so difficult is that nobody really understands what they do. It's a very specialized business. We don't talk a lot about it in the press. If you read a story about an election in the news, what they're usually talking about is the campaign. I love these stories that say the cost of the 2016 election was blah, blah, blah. No, no, no. That was the cost of the campaigns. There was a cost of the election. It was borne by county governments all over the country, but we don't talk about it. So we really have to learn how to separate what actually happens in running the election and what actually happens in running the campaign. How many of you, just as an example about how this is more complicated than you think, how many of you know why we don't vote online right now? How many of you know why it's hard? Has it ever crossed your mind about like, hey, I can do my banking online. This seems stupid that I can't cast a ballot online. There's a reason for that. It's because when you bank, or when you do almost anything else online, you would never separate the person who's taking the action, so me, when I'm depositing a check into my account, with the action that I've taken, the money that goes into my account. In voting, that's the first thing we do. We have what's called a secret ballot, which means as soon as the election office gets your ballot, they say, yes, Monica has voted, and Monica's ballot is going over here, and it's no longer Monica's ballot. It's ballot number 253479, blah, 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 blah. And we separate those immediately in the process so that you have a secret ballot and nobody can know who you voted for. We know that you voted or that you didn't, but not who you voted for. And that's what makes it hard. That's why we don't have things like online voting right now. So there's tons of these little discrepancies between how we think elections work and how it actually works that makes these things kind of hard. So I've been working for the past couple of years on a product called Ballot Scout. How many of you have ever tracked a package from Amazon? Everyone in the room, or FedEx, or whatever. So this seems like a really simple idea. The USPS actually provides a thing called intelligent mail barcodes that you can use for free. If you configure them and put them on an envelope, you can receive free tracking data back about this. It's a wonderful service. Every bill you have ever gotten has had an intelligent mail barcode on it, I guarantee, because they want your money. But elections wasn't really tracking your ballot envelopes if you're voting by mail. And if you've ever mailed anything through the US Postal Service, you know that sometimes this stuff gets lost. So we have been working on a project called Ballot Scout, which tracks ballots by mail. Again, another lesson about things are always harder than they seem, and they never survive first contact. When Chris built the first version of this system a couple years ago, the USPS would only deliver data over FTP. SFTP was not a set of acronyms that they knew. Those letters did not go together. They have since solved this problem. But there's all kinds of things, especially when you're dependent on other services. So Ballot Scout, we're dependent on voter data about who's receiving a ballot that's coming out of a state voter file system. They all look different. Data standardization is not a thing that happens in the elections world, which is another huge problem. We're working on it. So we're dependent on that data. We're dependent on the USPS scan data that comes back. And all of these other dependencies are not unique to this particular instance. All over government, whenever you want to do a thing in elections, you are dependent on all these different systems that have all these different data standards, and they don't talk to each other. And if you're working with a system from a private vendor, there's even some incentive for private vendors to make their systems not talk to each other, because that way it's hard to get data out and you have more incentive to stay with the system. So recently we've begun to focus on a different kind of challenge that touches a little bit on the vendor problem that I just touched on, which is The incentives are all wrong for governments to buy election technology. There's no incentive to innovate because nobody has any money to pay for anything because state governments are strapped for cash and so are locals. And that means that there's also no incentive to try new things because if you promise a voter, hey, we're going to track your mail ballots and you'll be able to see when it's coming to your door, and then you go, oh, well, the pilot program expired, we can't offer this going forward, your voters are going to be sad. So there's not really a great incentive to try new things and keep innovating, and there's no money to support that innovation, which also means the private vendor market doesn't tend to develop new things. So we have developed the Election Technology Cooperative. It is going to be a consortium of state and local governments who will pay a membership fee, but it's a flat fee that's easy to budget for. And we're going to intake technology from all around the sector, built by technologists, built by other local governments. There are a couple of cool projects that election administrators have built for themselves because they can't find anything from the private market. We'll intake those, try and make them more flexible and widely usable across the country. I talked about those data issues that vary from state to state. That's part of what makes it hard for technology in one state to be used by another state and bring those costs down. So we're hoping to help people build more flexible open source technology with this. And I'll just play you a quick video about this project.
All over the country, election officials are working on new ideas to address the needs of their voters. But with limited resources, good ideas don't always take off. The Election Technology Cooperative is a nonpartisan, nonprofit community with one purpose: to build, scale, and share innovative election technology. Working together within this framework, we are making better tools more available and affordable to election officials everywhere. Join us.
They're so adorable. I love the bouncing heads. So my pitch to you is, if you care about this stuff, if you think that election technology needs to be better, if you would like the voting experience to be better, there are opportunities for talented developers, talented product designers, talented UX and UI designers to plug into governments all over the country if you're willing to donate your time. And the Election Technology Cooperative is one way to do it. And now I'm going to bring Mike back up so he can talk about some more ways you can get involved in helping to save democracy.
Great job. Thank you. So I gave the little tidbit about George Washington earlier. This is another thing that I love to do when I'm talking to a crowd about democracy. I would like you to choose one of these two options and raise your hand for the one that you think is right. Whether there was a higher voter turnout in 2016, which was Hillary and Trump, or 2012, Obama and Romney. If you think the voter turnout was higher in 2016 than it was in 2012, raise your hand. Okay. If you think the voter turnout was higher in 2012 than it was in 2016, raise your hand. All right. That is generally what we see when we ask that question. It was, in fact, a tick higher in 2016. It was nearly a dead heat. But I think that that's interesting. Most people, when they think back on the 2016 election, imagine that nobody wanted to vote, that the candidates weren't compelling, right? My team is laughing, but hopefully you guys found that mildly amusing. Anyway, I just think that's an interesting tidbit. So let me pull back up the PowerPoint here. Briefly, things you can do to get involved. There are so many ways you can get involved to help fix democracy. I'm going to leave this slide up for a little while, but I'm going to run through it real quick so that we can start our panel here. Ask a civic tech nonprofit whether there are distinct projects that you can help out with, for example, user tests. That is super helpful. It's something that you don't need a lot of context to be able to do, and that is information that a civic tech nonprofit can use to great effect. Find nonprofits that have data sets or APIs that you can build a distinct tool on. Like, for example, you want to build a pledge to vote tool, and you know that there's a nonprofit that has the right data sets, or they might have the right data sets to build a pledge to vote tool. You can ask them, can I build this tool for you and give it to you for you to roll out to your stakeholders? And then for those people who might not be as technical or just don't want to go that route, you can advocate for your company to include voter engagement in your onboarding process or other HR stuff. advocate for your company to make Election Day a holiday, be a poll worker, that's super important, volunteer in your election office. And lastly, ragtag.org is a new nonprofit that I happen to know the founder of. I haven't worked with them too much, so I don't know how they're doing right now, but it's a nonprofit that matches up technologists with nonprofits that are trying to accomplish interesting things. So I don't know what projects they're working on right now or what's been going on with them lately, but they might be a good place to check out. So with that, I'm going to invite everybody back up for a Q&A. And thank you, everybody.
Awesome. And I'm just going to kick things off with a non-scripted question. Mike and company, what makes this work so complicated?
Anybody want to take that first?
Well, first thing, it's all the thousands of different election authorities in the country. They all have different sets of rules, different regulations, some people say you can vote online, some people say you can't. And they're also not the most responsive people because they have so many other things that they have to deal with. And so building a system and making it general so that it applies to all those different election authorities is really difficult since there is no generality among them.
I'd say that it's because very few people find democracy as sexy as I do. And just finding a way to make democracy compelling. I mean, puppies and kitties are way more compelling than democracy. So it's way easier for Sarah McLachlan to get on your television and sing a song, and you're like, Jesus Christ, I need to give them money. But it's much harder to find a way to communicate democracy in a way where it connects with you.
I think the solution is to put cats on the Democracy Works website.
Yeah.
Over here, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Hey, thanks so much for your presentation. I completely agree with you that democracy seems quite broken. One of the problems, it seems, is that one of our parties is heavily invested in keeping it broken and maintaining the status quo. I was wondering how your very high-minded aspirations of nonpartisanship kind of might butt up against that, and do you see that as impairing your mission at all?
That's a good question and a delicate one. I can say that we are lucky to have relationships with people on all sides of the aisle. I won't even say both sides, because it's hard to know which side is which sometimes. But that we have relationships with people all over the place that are super passionate about this. And I can tell you with full certainty that it doesn't matter who you're imagining as a stakeholder group, there is somebody there who really wants to fix this issue. I don't know if you guys want to.
Yeah, I can chime in on that. So I thought the same thing. I come from a partisan campaign background back in another life, and I was very much invested in that worldview, and then I met election administrators. And I can tell you that, like any group, there are a few bad apples that I don't like dealing with, but by and large, they are an amazing group of people, and they care way more about practicality and what makes sense for their voters, and they really have a very customer service, voter service attitude about it. It was not something I expected when I started working with these folks, and it has floored me and excited me about this work. People ask me why I love it so much, and it's these people, and it's because you will find voter advocates on every side of the aisle when you actually get to election administrators. Sometimes that takes a little bit of work to get through the candidates that sit at the top of the office or whatever, but when you get down to the people who actually run the elections, they are by and large an amazing group of people whose primary goal is to make sure they run a fair election. You have to remember that the worst nightmare for an election official, even if they're a partisan person who ran as part of a party office and got elected to county clerk or something like that, their nightmare is getting their face on the front page of the paper because something went wrong or one side or the other thinks the election was unfair. So these folks are actually very invested in running straight down the middle, fair elections that are trusted by both sides, because that's the only way that they keep their job. So it can be difficult sometimes, especially when you hold personal views, which all of us do. But I will say I have been so encouraged to get to know the community and realize that there are so many people from every side of the aisle who really care about making this process work for voters.
All right, thank you. We have another question back here.
Oh, we have one up here first, actually.
Recently, they were reporting that the Russians hacked the election, tried to break into 21 voting systems, were successful in a number of those systems, about 5 or 6. You're developing a national voter system or a national base. which would be ideal for hacking and Russian to track, to block into, send out false text messages, say vote today when it's not vote today, or do any number of things. You can't really secure the system. So the system of being divided among so many different municipalities, et cetera, is a safeguard to the system to centralize it the way you guys want to do it, make it the biggest target there is for anybody who wanted to cause mischief. How are you going to secure it if you can't really secure it?
I'm happy to address it from a non-technical level, but if you guys want to do it, do you want to talk about it technically at all? Yeah. So one thing that we have working in our favor is that we use the data that we have is the national or is the voter file data. So it's not data. People give us the data so that we can help serve them, but it's not like we're the only owners of this data.
But you're centralized.
Right.
Places you have to hit 50, 100, 500 different databases to try to track in.
So that's not entirely true. Yeah, voter file vendors have a centralized database of every single voter in the country, and we are not a voter file vendor. So just on the PII, the data that we're collecting from users, we are not nearly as broad as there are other for-profit companies mostly out there who have access to PII. Now, what you're talking about with reminders, sending out false reminders, is a valid concern, and both are valid concerns, to be honest. If every single time we do anything that we had a user last year who thought that we were sending incorrect reminders. It turns out we weren't. I got a call from the DNC within 6 hours. And so the report back loop, which is completely unofficial and could come from anywhere, is very fast for us. And we can only do as much as we can do to protect against things before they happen and address them as soon as they do happen. Fortunately, we have not had any sort of attack on our system or anything like that. But I don't know if you guys want to talk about it from a different tech perspective.
I can say that, so we use Amazon Web Services for everything. And Amazon has been pretty free with time to help us make sure that we are using their systems in a way that is secure and and locked down. All of our databases are, for example, they're encrypted at rest. Like if something was happening and we could say to Amazon shut it down, no one would be able to read the data anymore. That's sort of how it works. No, Amazon has been. Go ahead.
Has your system been attacked yet? I mean, you're online. Have you noticed any attacking? Do you have appropriate safeguards? Do you screen people like you to see that you might not have a background that could subject yourself to be blackmailed, where then you would give information, etc.?
Everyone here on the camera, he was asking if you have been attacked in the past, or what safeguards you have in place.
So I can address that. We are in a position where we have worked with many of the largest corporations in the United States, and when you are doing any sort of data work with them around PII or anything like this, you have to go with a tremendously rigorous security review. Yeah. And we have passed every single one that we have been through. And I'm not at liberty to talk about what those actually look like, but if you look at some of our partnerships and the people who have signed off on our security practices, I think that might give you some amount of confidence.
Yeah, there's also, I will say, on the election security side, so no voting system has actually been breached. That's a yet, because it's not like the Russians aren't capable. It's just like it hasn't happened yet. We did see one voter registration database in Illinois that actually got breached last year, in 2016, and they caught it in time. But election security is a huge topic on my side of the house on the election administration. There's a brand new report out, if you're curious about this, from the Belfer Center at Harvard. It's an offshoot of the Kennedy School, talking about just basic nuts and bolts cybersecurity for elections, for the state and local election administrators. I encourage you, that came out today, I encourage you to check out that report. And we actually do plan it. I was talking to someone earlier before the panel about things like risk limiting audits. audits, which Colorado rolled out last year. So a risk limiting audit basically allows you to do the same sort of auditing of an election result to make sure the right person actually won the election based on the votes that were cast. But instead of having to hand audit every paper ballot, which is hugely expensive, that's what we call a recount in this country, but we don't do it unless it's really close or unless someone pays for it because it's millions of dollars. A risk limiting audit does some fancy math and allows you to say you only have to count X number of paper ballots, but that will give you a 95% confidence interval that the right person was elected. So there are a lot of innovations that are happening, like risk limiting audits in the election administration space, to make sure that we're satisfying chain of custody requirements for ballots and that we are making sure that the outcome of the election was as cast. It's a huge, huge topic right now. It's been badly reported. I'll just say that the media has no interest in dampening down your fears. They would like you to believe that nothing is real, and unfortunately that has a real effect on voter confidence, and it's going to have an effect on turnout, because if people think everything's hacked and rigged and blah, 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 then there's no reason to go vote. And it's not entirely true. The threat is real, but the reporting has been bad. So I do encourage people to actually go talk to your election official. This is another place where going to be a poll worker really helps, because if you see the systems in place, you can actually watch chain of custody happen. You can actually watch how the ballots get passed and make sure that your vote is actually secret and things like that. And it's a great way to sort of get hands-on information about how this works.
We have a few more questions, so hold on one second.
Do you have the ability to reach landlines, and do you have the ability to do direct mail? And if you can do direct mail, do you have any funding sources for the postage?
The only direct mail we do is to send to voters, in some cases, their pre-filled voter registration forms, so that with a pre-stamped, pre-addressed envelope to get it back to their election official. But we do not do any sort of outreach via direct mail, and we don't do anything with landlines. We don't call people. We only use SMS.
Campaigns are moving away from that technology too. As soon as campaigns started to actually empirically test what worked, those technologies started to be less and less effective. They do work for certain demographics, but they're falling out of favor across the board.
All right, but not everyone has the most updated browser.
Yeah, you are right. Our platform will not be able to reach every single eligible voter in the United States at this time, and I think that we are comfortable with the idea that we can reach the vast majority of voters and over time find out how to reach everybody. To be honest, there are so many problems to solve. To try to bite off more than we can chew is something we already do every day, and we're very much digital first.
We are going to take a few more questions, but I'm sure you'll be around for a few minutes after. If anyone has any direct questions, you can stop up and ask them. So go ahead.
We have another one right here.
Thanks for the presentation. It was amazing. I think my main question is around one of the points you quickly glossed over, which is the collection of the data itself. How do you find out which election office is actually, what the deadlines are, what are the rules? Because that seems like the more complicated one. Do you have a system which alerts you that, okay, you need to reach out to these counties or these districts to actually collect the latest information? Do you have volunteers who actually call them up? If so, how do you route the calls to them?
So we actually have a research team that calls up all the election authorities, and sometimes they have to keep calling them over and over. Sometimes some election authorities have all their information in a easily accessible online place, so that they could just take it from that page and then put it in the database. Sometimes they actually have to get wrangled. It's one of the hardest things that we do, is to make sure that our election database is up to date. And at this point, it's people making the calls. Like, we would love to build some technology to be able to compile all that data automatically, but AI isn't strong enough yet.
I would add that as we do it more and more, we learn the places that we need to check more frequently. And so we cover, if it's a jurisdiction of 5,000 voters or more, last year we nabbed probably 90-something% of those elections. And we got most of the elections under a jurisdiction of 5,000. But we will always miss some number of elections. It's impossible to catch every single one. Or maybe one day we'll figure it out.
And there's other data that we are providing. For example, voter ID rules. So for like the 2016 election, for example, right, like the vote tomorrow emails, we would say like here's the documentation that you may need to bring. And those rules were changing in some states, like up until the day before the election, because of court rulings. And so, yeah, there's just there's no magic way to do it except like have people, and we have, when we pay people to watch that.
Yeah, the only other thing I'll say is this is a really nice synergy. A lot of people are like, oh, well, you TurboVote, but you also work with government. That's a little weird. But this is actually one of the nice synergies about it, because we work with every state election office in the country. We work with most of the county offices in the country. So that makes our research process a little bit easier because we already have relationships with people. And through the VIP program, sometimes we know if polling places are changing on election day. Sometimes we know before the state will know. And so there's a huge synergy between all of our networks to sort of make sure everybody has updated information and that voters have the most updated information.
And I would shout out our research team because they are absolutely amazing.
All right, we have another question back here.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I know you guys are focusing on the actual initial election, but I'm wondering if you know anyone or know any startups that are focusing on making sure that constituents can contact their elected officials, because I think that people find that very daunting.
Yeah, there are a number of platforms that help people contact their election officials. The one that is immediately coming to mind, although I know of like 6 others, is Countable. Countable is a good platform for that purpose. Can you guys think of any other? I'll keep thinking on it.
ResistBot,
yeah,
is one where you can text a phone number, and they help you figure out how and who to contact, and can send some communication on your behalf as well.
If you really want a list of them, come up and grab my card and email me, and then I'll be able to compile them when my brain's functioning more clearly.
So in the interest of time, this is probably going to be the last question because we're coming up on the time we have allotted for the presentation. But we do advise that you go after the presentation and bother the TurboVote people and keep them from going home with your personal questions.
Hi, thank you guys for your time. I'm just curious as to what you guys would say are the biggest factors that keep us from standardizing voting systems across the board from division to division, and do you ever think that we'll get to a point where we have a standard voting system regardless of where you live?
Yeah, so there's 2 big factors. One, this gentleman in the front mentioned, it was a really astute observation, which is that in some ways our kind of balkanized election system where it's run at a very local level is a security measure. It makes it a heck of a lot harder to hack our elections because you're going to have to hack an awful lot of jurisdictions to make a difference. So in some ways that's actually good. Now, what you're talking about is happening. So states are moving towards buying the same voting machine for their entire state. They will pool all their money together for all their counties or whatever, and actually purchase a single voting system or maybe one of 2 across the state, and that gives them economies of scale. They get better purchasing contracts if they can buy in bulk like that, and it also makes the experience more seamless for voters within a single state. But if you've ever moved across state lines and tried to vote again, you will notice it's a completely different experience, sometimes county to county, but always across state lines. And that has to do with the federalist system that we have. Elections are one of those things that states feel very strongly that they are the ones who run elections, the localities are the ones with the actual implementation, and the states are the ones that make the rules. Anytime the federal government tries to come play in it, there's a lot of resistance to it. You saw that with elections being designated as critical infrastructure at the beginning of 2017. That just meant that the Department of Homeland Security could come in and help with election security, but there was a lot of pushback from secretaries of state who were saying, whoa, federal government, you're in our business. So that's part of it too. I will say there are a couple exciting initiatives that are happening towards making it easier to standardize the experience even when you don't have the same voting system. So there are a couple of data standardization initiatives that are going on through the Election Assistance Commission and the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, that are working on coming up with a standard data set for voter registration, for voter files, for transferring district data back and forth. And once we have that data standard, that's going to help a lot because we can get the private vendors to actually start using it, and then that makes data from system to system transferable, and that's going to help a lot with interoperability and things like that. So that's a huge problem, but we are making progress towards it. It's something that the whole field recognizes, but as with anything that's a private market, there's always going to be competition and people trying to do the next big thing, which I think is good for it.
We had a request for a quick shout out.
With regard to apps that allow you to find elected officials in your area, there's an amazing app called tryvoices.com. I think it's Android and iOS. I learned about that through the League of Women Voters.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here this evening. Everyone, thank you for joining us. Everyone will be sticking around for a little bit if you have additional questions, and make sure you come back and see us next month. Thank you.
Big thanks to the TurboVote team for coming.
Go vote. Don't forget to vote.